Story 1. The Death of Ken Rex McElroy. He terrorized Skidmore, Missouri, for decades, stalking, assaulting, and raping two 14-year-olds who were his wives. And he was suspected of murder. He had an expensive attorney, so he was never charged. The law never helped the poor town. One day the town gathered for a meeting on how to deal with McElroy. Details are a little vague, but apparently someone alerted the room that McElroy was in the bar up the street. Quietly and calmly, everyone got up and walked over to the bar. As McElroy got into his truck, someone shot him in the back of the head. The town then went back to business. When witnesses, essentially the entire town, were questioned, everyone claimed they did not see anything. No one has ever been arrested. Story 2. In 1980, Lake Peigneur in Louisiana drained like a bathtub after oil drillers on a rig struck a salt mine shaft below. The rig, barges, a tugboat, and part of a nearby island were sucked into the largest man-made whirlpool on record. Story 3. Operation Mincemeat. The Allies planted a dead body carrying fake battle plans to trick the Germans into believing they would attack Sardinia, when in fact the attack was aimed at Sicily. They created an entire identity for the deceased, fictitious military officer, set him adrift in the ocean, and successfully misled the Germans. Story 4. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a novel in 1838 in which four shipwrecked survivors, on the verge of starvation, resort to cannibalism and kill the young cabin boy Richard Parker. In 1884, the yacht Mignonette sank. Four crew members survived and, while starving, killed and ate the youngest of them, also named Richard Parker. Story 5. In 1971, a teenage girl named Julianne Coepke was on a plane that was struck by lightning and disintegrated midair. She fell 3,000 meters while strapped to her seat and landed in the Amazon rainforest. Her mother had been on the flight. Julianne searched in vain for her and was the sole survivor of the crash. She survived 11 days alone, treating wounds infested with maggots with fuel and using tracking techniques her father had taught her before she found a boat and made her way back to civilization. What an absolute legend. Story 6. Soviet scientists starved to death while saving the seed bank in Leningrad during Hitler's invasion in the winter of 1941 to 1942. Despite the seed bank being full of corn, wheat, and potatoes. Story 7. Wojciech was a bear who fought Nazis in exchange for cigarettes and beer. He didn't die until 20 years after World War II. Story 8. The Central Intelligence Agency researched psychic abilities for 30 years as a way to spy on the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. After that period, the program was terminated, and the conclusion was that psychic powers probably do not exist. The actual conclusion stated that the evidence for remote viewing was unfalsifiable and therefore unprovable. Many promising results were believed to be caused by information leakage, meaning that test subjects had prior knowledge about the targets. Because of this, investigators were unable to verify results, and even if psychic abilities existed, they were at best unreliable. The code name for the project was Stargate, and related documents are available on the Central Intelligence Agency website. Story 9. Due to a military standoff that lasted for years, 15 ships became stranded in an inland sea and, over 8 years, formed a multinational shipboard society that included its own currency. Story 10. The battle for Castle Itter near the end of World War II saw United States soldiers, French prisoners of war, and the German army fighting on the same side to hold the castle against a Schutzstaffel tank division. To make it even weirder, the French prisoners included several prime ministers and a tennis star. Story 11. The escape from Antarctica by the members of the expedition led by Ernest Shackleton was extraordinary. Their ship, the Endurance, was crushed by ice floes, and they were stranded on the ice for more than a year in temperatures well below freezing. They then took to 3 lifeboats, each about 22 feet long, and crossed the Southern Ocean looking for land. There were about 10 men in each boat, and at times they missed land by only a few miles. 2/3 of the men ended up stranded on Elephant Island, surrounded by ice, while one boat set out to seek rescue. That boat crossed the Drake Passage, one of the deadliest areas of ocean. All but 3 of the crew were stranded on the ice with little food and water. The 3 men who left became the first to cross South Georgia on foot. They reached civilization and returned to rescue the men on Elephant Island after several months. Every person who had sailed on the original voyage survived. The worst lasting consequence was the amputation of one foot. Story 12. Unsinkable Sam was a cat that survived the sinking of 3 different ships during World War II. Story 13. Apparently death from laughter is an incredibly rare but legitimate cause of death. In the 3rd century before Common Era, Chrysippus, a Greek Stoic philosopher, reportedly died of laughter after he saw a donkey eating his figs. Chrysippus is not the only isolated case. Zeuxis, a 5th century before Common Era Greek painter, is said to have died laughing at his painting of the goddess Aphrodite, for which an old woman who had commissioned the painting insisted on modeling. Also, Cleopatra, the ruler of Egypt in the 1st century before Common Era, is said to have had a retainer who died laughing at her husband's death. According to Wikipedia, the most recent case is that of Ole Benson, a Danish audiologist who saw a funny scene in a comedy film and laughed so hard that his heart rate rose to a point where he suffered a fatal heart attack in 1989. From what I understand, it is not the act of laughing itself but the fatal consequence of a severe fit of laughter, such as cardiac arrest, asphyxiation, or an aneurysm that causes death. For instance, Ole Benson suffered a heart attack as a consequence of the extreme fit of laughter he had. It is possible that this was also the case for Chrysippus and others. I always thought, "I'm going to die laughing," was a hyperbole, and I use it quite liberally, but I suppose every hyperbole has a grain of truth. Story 14. The Bone Wars. 2 rival paleontologists, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, raced for academic clout. They traveled to fossil beds in Montana and Utah to dig up as many dinosaurs as possible before the other. They hired spies and saboteurs to impede each other's work and sometimes tried to pass off sloppy or fake skeletons. The overwhelming majority of iconic dinosaur genera were either first discovered during that period or gained many new specimens and became famous because of the publicity. This includes Triceratops, Stegosaurus, some remains of Tyrannosaurus, Apatosaurus, and many more. This is also where the Brontosaurus confusion comes from. One scientist had already named Apatosaurus. The other later displayed a skeleton with a skull from a different genus, Camarasaurus, and presented it as a new species called Brontosaurus. The error was revealed relatively quickly, but the name stuck. More recently, improved techniques for distinguishing subtle differences in bones showed that the skeleton once called Brontosaurus is distinct enough to warrant its own genus, and the name Brontosaurus was revived. I have always thought this would make a fantastic show, especially if it includes dramatized flashbacks to how the dinosaurs in the skeletons died. The Bone Wars, also known as the Great Dinosaur Rush, was a period of intense and ruthlessly competitive fossil hunting and discovery during the Gilded Age of American history. It was marked by a heated rivalry between Edward Drinker Cope of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia and Othniel Charles Marsh of the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale. Each used underhanded methods in the field, resorting to bribery, theft, and the destruction of bones. They also sought to ruin their rival's reputation and cut off his funding by attacking him in scientific publications. The Bone Wars left a large positive legacy for paleontology as a field but left both scientists financially and socially ruined. A bittersweet ending. Story 15. At President Andrew Jackson's funeral in 1845, his pet parrot had to be removed because it was swearing loudly. Story 16. An English king named Ethelred, later called the Unready, led troops to defend against a Viking invasion. The weather was bad, and many Viking ships were wrecked while landing. Ethelred thought it would be dishonorable to attack them as they stumbled ashore, so he held his men back until the Vikings formed proper battle lines. The better prepared Vikings won the fight, slaughtering many of Ethelred's men. He and the survivors were forced to flee while the Vikings pillaged the area. Story 17. Jean de Clisson, 1300 to 1359, was married to a French nobleman who was beheaded for treason by the French king. Enraged, she sold their estate, purchased 3 black warships with red sails, and became a pirate queen of the English Channel who targeted French ships. She became known as the Lioness of Brittany. During 13 years of piracy, She ordered the slaughter of every member of a ship's crew except one, so that the survivor could return and tell the French king what had happened. Story 18. Joshua Norton was an eccentric man from San Francisco who was frustrated with the political chaos of his time and believed he could do the job better himself. He declared himself the Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. Although he held no real power, people liked him so much that they treated him like royalty. Currency issued in his name was accepted as real money at many establishments. One day he was arrested by a private security force because of concerns about his mental health, which enraged much of San Francisco. The police chief released him because he had committed no crime, and Norton issued an imperial pardon to the man who had arrested him. After this incident, police officers Norton passed would salute him. Another time, when a riot formed and grew violent, Norton stood in front of the mob and calmly prayed, which managed to disperse it. And that is not even a fraction of the extraordinary things he did. Story 19. The London beer flood of 1814 began when a 22-foot-tall beer vat burst, releasing at least 100,000 and possibly as much as 323,000 imperial gallons of beer into nearby slum dwellings and killing 8 people. 5 of the victims were attending a celebration of life for someone else. Story 20. On February 11, 1985, contact with the Salyut 7 space station was lost. The station began to drift and all systems shut down. At that time, the station was uninhabited. Cosmonaut Vladimir Zanabekov piloted his spacecraft to intercept the forward port of Salyut 7 and matched the station's rotation. After a hard dock and confirming the station's electrical system was dead, Zanabekov and Viktor Savinik sampled the station atmosphere before opening the hatch. Wearing winter fur-lined clothing, they entered the station to conduct repairs. Story 21. During World War II, the United States military researched the idea of dropping bombs filled with bats fitted with incendiary devices over Japan. A dental surgeon named Adams, who was an acquaintance of Eleanor Roosevelt, wrote the idea to her. He explained that bats would nest in the wooden buildings of Tokyo, and then the delayed timers on the incendiary devices would go off simultaneously and cause a massive fire. President Roosevelt approved the idea for study. The military found it would be highly effective compared to traditional firebombing campaigns. The only reason the plan was not implemented was that the bat bombs would not have been combat-ready until mid-1945, so the atomic bombs were used instead. I recommend reading the article. It contains many surprising details and reads like a surreal satirical piece. Story 22. Sergeant Stubby was a dog who served during World War I. A soldier found a stray dog while training on the Yale University campus and took a liking to him. The soldier smuggled the dog onto the ship when he had to leave campus, and when the dog was discovered by the commanding officer, he was allowed to stay because the dog had learned how to salute. Stubby was injured several times during the war, but he proved useful by alerting his squad to surprise mustard gas attacks and to gunfire before human ears could detect it. He also located and comforted wounded soldiers, and held a German soldier by the leg of his pants until American soldiers arrived. Also known as a celebrated war dog. Story 23. Jack was a baboon employed to change rail signals. After initial skepticism, the railway officially employed Jack once his competence for the job was verified. The baboon was paid 20 cents a day and half a bottle of beer each week. It is widely reported that in his 9 years of employment with the railway, Jack never made a mistake. Story 24. The East German balloon escape. In 1979, 2 families fled East Germany for West Germany in a homemade hot air balloon. Story 25. Louis XIX was King of France for 20 minutes. The shortest war ever recorded lasted around 40 minutes. During the Salem witch trials, dogs were accused of witchcraft. 2 were executed. Story 26. Brazil sent boats to assist in the war, panicked when they saw bubbles, and accidentally killed a rare species of dwarf whale because they thought the animals were German submarines. Story 27. In 2007, a paraglider was trapped in the updraft between 2 merging thunderstorms and was lifted to an altitude of 33,000 feet. She landed more than 3 hours later about 60 kilometers north of her starting position, having survived extreme cold, lightning, and lack of oxygen. Story 28. A Russian czar had a bomb thrown at him. He avoided it and, oddly, stayed to inspect the damage. Then a second man entered carrying another bomb. Story 29. During World War I, the German Navy built a ship and painted it to look like the British Royal Mail ship Carmania to infiltrate and attack British convoys. On its first outing, it encountered the real British Royal Mail ship Carmania, which promptly sank it. Story 30. The Carrington Event. In 1859, Earth was hit by a geomagnetic storm from the sun, caused auroras as far south as Rome. Telegraph wires caught fire, and, in general, it was chaos. If this happened today, it would likely cause massive blackouts for weeks or even months and cause trillions of dollars in damage. Story 31. Timothy Dexter was frequently given terrible business advice that, through a stroke of luck, paid off. He sold coal to Newcastle and made a profit. He became wealthy, dressed eccentrically, and behaved oddly among the elite he had accidentally joined. He spent a lot of time gaslighting his wife for his amusement. For quite some time he acted as if she had died and was a ghost, even introducing her to other people as his wife's ghost. At one point he faked his own death to see how people would react at his funeral. He wrote a book that was a long-winded rant about everything that upset him. The book included no punctuation. He published a second edition with several pages of punctuation attached to the end for the reader to distribute as they saw fit. He was essentially a real-life shitpost. Story 32. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 occurred when a storage tank holding 2 million gallons of molasses burst, sending a tidal wave through the streets of Boston and killing 21 people. Story 33. The Roman Emperor Caligula once declared war on Neptune, the god of the sea. He led his soldiers to a beach and ordered them to stab the water. Story 34. Several years ago in Indianapolis, a couple attempted to commit insurance fraud by bombing an entire neighborhood. The explosion killed 2 people, injured several others, and destroyed more than 30 houses. Story 35. The Biafran genocide, also known as the Nigerian Civil War, occurred only about 50 years ago, and over 3 million civilians died. My dad fought in the war as a child soldier on the Biafran side. You have probably never heard of it, despite its scale and recency, because it has been almost entirely swept under the rug. They do not even teach it in history class. Edit. Thanks for your concern regarding my father. He lost a substantial number of his childhood friends to the war. He was also bombed while in class and was among the few survivors, but he is, as far as I can tell, pretty well adjusted. He does not go into too much detail about it, and he still gets pretty angry on the inside, but he has come to accept it and looks toward the future. Story 36. In 1993, a man taught geese to follow his ultralight aircraft. Because the birds did not know how to migrate, he guided them to the area where geese typically migrate. Story 37. Spartan weddings involved young Spartan men who trained for years in camps and were surrounded only by other men. When it was time for marriage, the brides shaved their heads and dressed in male clothing because the grooms were reportedly uncomfortable with intimacy with anyone other than a man. Story 38. The Battle off Selmar. October 25, 1944. Task Group 77. 3, known as Taffy 3, a group of about a dozen small American escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts, found itself under attack by the Japanese Center Force, roughly 24 of the most powerful warships in the Imperial Japanese Navy, including battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Thanks to the bravery and determination of every ship involved, and serious errors by the Japanese commanders, the Americans inflicted heavy casualties and forced the Japanese to retreat. The Japanese center force included the Yamato-class battleship Yamato, the Nagato-class battleship Nagato, the Kongo-class battlecruisers Kongo and Haruna, Tone-class heavy cruisers Tone and Shikuma, Mogami-class heavy cruisers Kumano and Suzuya, the Myoko-class heavy cruiser Haguro, the Takao-class heavy cruiser Chokai, Agano-class light cruisers Noshiro and Yahagi, Yugimo-class destroyers Kayashimo, Akishimo, Asashimo, Fujinami, Hamanami, Hayashimo, Kishinami, Okinami, and Naganami, the Shimakaze-class destroyer Shimakaze, and Kajiro-class destroyers Hamikaze, Isokaze, Nowaki, Urikaze, and the famously lucky Yukikaze. American forces in Taffy 3 consisted of Casablanca-class escort carriers Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitcun Bay, and Gamber Bay, Fletcher-class destroyers Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, and John C. Butler-class destroyer escorts John C. Butler, Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond, and Dennis. Yamato alone displaced slightly more than every ship in Taffy 3 combined. The Americans had nothing larger than 5-inch guns, while the Japanese had guns up to 18 inches. Despite being outgunned and outmassed, the Americans had several advantages. Their ships generally had better fire control systems. Yamato was the only ship in the center force with some form of automated fire control, while most Japanese ships relied on optical rangefinders and manual methods, diminishing their accuracy. To contrast, even the United States destroyers had automated fire control. The carriers still had over 100 aircraft between them, and later reinforcements from Taffy 1 and Taffy 2 would arrive. Those aircraft, though outfitted for land targets and anti-submarine work, were used effectively to cause confusion and chaos among the Japanese, with some pilots making dry runs and buzzes to force enemy ships to evade. The commander of the center force, Takeo Kurita, also lacked charts for escort carriers and believed them to be fleet carriers, and he misidentified their escorts as cruisers. He had not slept in 3 days and had no communication from the southern force he was meant to join. These factors led him to greatly overestimate the size and strength of the American forces and to use the wrong type of ammunition against lightly armored ships for much of the battle. The Japanese forces were also disorganized tactically, with orders changing from anti-aircraft circles to general attacks and divisions operating independently, which reduced coordinated fire and increased the risk of friendly fire. Even so, the disparity in firepower made a Japanese victory seem certain. The battle's outcome was nevertheless a dramatic upset. Some highlights of the ship-to-ship combat. The destroyer Johnston charged the entire fleet alone, scoring first blood by blowing the bow off the heavy cruiser Kumano, which also put Kumano's sister ship Suzuya temporarily out of the fight as she came alongside to assist. Johnston also fired on the battlecruiser Haruna and the heavy cruiser Tone, and drove off an entire destroyer squadron. Johnston endured near-constant heavy gunfire and remained operational as repair crews worked furiously. In her final moments, she exchanged fire with multiple cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese believed she was a cruiser, and when she sank, the captain of the destroyer Yukike's reportedly saluted her. The destroyer Heermann exchanged broadsides with the battleship Nagato and heavy cruisers Haguro and Tone, and later assisted the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts in her attack on the heavy cruiser Chikuma. Heermann was the only destroyer of Taffy 3 to survive the battle, and she barely remained afloat. The destroyer hull fired torpedo attacks that temporarily forced Yamato, Haruna, and Kongo to evade, and engaged Tone for a time, drawing fire away from the carriers. Hull was sunk early, but her actions helped protect the other American ships. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts charged the Japanese force alongside the destroyers despite being slower and more lightly armed, striking the cruiser Chokai with at least one torpedo. She is best known for pouring her entire ammunition supply, including anti-aircraft rounds and star shells, into the cruiser Chikuma, severely damaging her stern, mauling her superstructure, and setting her bridge on fire. One of Samuel B. Roberts's guns exploded from overuse. Chikuma was later scuttled, in part because of the damage she had sustained. Samuel B. Roberts did not survive the battle. She was the only destroyer escort lost at Salmar. The other destroyer escorts remained with the carriers, took damage, and expended their ammunition. Multiple escort carriers scored hits on pursuing Japanese cruisers with their single stern-mounted 5-inch gun. One hit was initially thought to have caused a catastrophic chain of explosions that crippled Chokai, but later studies suggested the explosions were likely the result of friendly fire from the battlecruiser Kongo. In total, 3 Japanese cruisers were sunk or scuttled: Chikuma, Suzuya, and Chokai, and 3 more were heavily damaged: Kumano, Haguro, and Tone. One Japanese destroyer, Nowaki, was damaged and later sunk while retreating. Every battleship and battlecruiser except Yamato took damage and was put out of action for the remainder of the war. The United States lost 2 escort carriers, Gamber Bay and St. Lo, 2 destroyers, Johnston and Hull, and 1 destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts, with most other American ships sustaining damage. These losses mattered little to the United States Navy overall because these ship types were being mass-produced and were relatively expendable. There was no logical reason for Taffy 3 to prevail against such overwhelming odds. Yet through courage, initiative, and tenacity, Task Group 77 3 saved the transport ships supporting the invasion of the Philippines and dealt a severe blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Story 39. A poodle named Kashi in Caballito, Buenos Aires, fell from the 13th floor and struck 75-year-old Marta Espina, killing them both instantly. Shortly afterward, 46-year-old Edith Sola, who had come to see the incident, was fatally struck by a bus. An unidentified man who witnessed Edith's death suffered a heart attack and died on his way to the hospital. Story 40. Mad Jack Churchill was the man with the only confirmed longbow kill in World War II. He and his squad made a death march toward the Germans while he played the bagpipes. He was captured, sent to a concentration camp, escaped, was recaptured, and escaped again from another camp. He always carried a Scottish longsword. There are so many other strange things he did after the war, and it is amazing that he was entirely real. Story 41. During World War I, the German Empire bombarded Osowiec Fortress with poison gas while it was defended by the Russian Empire. After some time, Russian soldiers charged the now entrenched German positions, covered in blood, with bloodshot eyes and coughing up portions of their lungs. The German army opened fire with rifles and machine guns but later retreated because the soldiers appeared to be undead. The event became known as the Attack of the Dead Men. Story 42. 4 Auschwitz prisoners stole Nazi uniforms and a car. Only one of them spoke German, so he wore the highest rank uniform. After they left the camp, they encountered 2 patrols. The first patrol, led by a high-ranking officer, hailed them. The second patrol, consisting of 2 low-ranking soldiers, told them they could not leave because they had orders. The man who spoke German shouted at them so loudly and convincingly that they apologized and let them go. Update. Reddit user Aviation Atom found a documentary about this. Thanks again to Aviation Atom. I hope people will stop asking for it in comments. Story 43. The Children's Crusade. In the mid-12th to early 13th centuries, as many as 30,000 children followed a few teenagers in an effort to convert Muslims to Christianity. It went about as well as one would expect. This event followed the disastrous Fourth Crusade, in which Catholic forces were excommunicated by the Pope and became a mercenary force. Story 44. Leo Major was a French-Canadian soldier who, among many other feats, captured a German communications truck, lost an eye to a phosphorus grenade in the process, and captured 100 German soldiers while on a reconnaissance mission during the Battle of the Scheldt. He single-handedly liberated the town of Zwolle, saving it and its population from being shelled during a morning assault. During that liberation, he captured about 90 more German soldiers, burned down the Gestapo headquarters, and continued fighting, shooting and throwing grenades so the Germans believed they were under serious attack. He was like the protagonist of a modern first-person shooter. Story 45. Tarare. Probably the only Wikipedia article I've ever read where they give up on dry scientific explanations and say, look, here's what the historical records say. Okay. Story 46. Harold Holt, the Prime Minister of Australia, went for a swim in the ocean in 1967 and was never seen again. Story 47. Bulgarian swineherd Ivailo became king and defeated the trained army of the reigning monarch. Story 48. The man from 4chan who said he was going to kill bin Laden with a sword was found in a desert in the Middle East with his sword. Edit. I found an article in a reply to my comment. Story 49. The Great Locust Swarm of 1875 was at one point measured at 100,000 square miles. The locusts ate everything in their path, even each other. The swarm was so thick that when it passed over an area it could block out the sun. Story 50. In 1962 in Peru, Two American scientists reported that a massive slab of rock had undermined a glacier on Huascaran, 6,768 meters above sea level. Their report was printed in a newspaper, and the government ordered them to retract it or face prison. They fled the country. 8 years later, an earthquake triggered a massive mudslide that buried the town of Yungay. Excavation of the site is forbidden by the government. The population before the mudslide was 20,000. Only 400 people survived. Story 51. The Emu War of 1932. Australia's emu population was getting out of hand. The government decided to take military action, but the operation failed. Story 52. When you read the real John Brown story, from Kansas to Harper's Ferry, it just doesn't seem real. Fundraising in Canada, clandestine activities, religion, calls for everyone to join, betrayal by friends, martyrdom, and so on. John Wilkes Booth was at his execution. Story 53. The surgery with a 300% mortality rate. It is a pretty great story. Story 54. There are 638 alleged assassination attempts on Castro, but only 7 are confirmed. They read like a comedy sketch. The Central Intelligence Agency once placed a seashell rigged with explosives where they thought Castro would see it, pick it up, and say, "Oh, cool shell." Despite this plan, Castro died of natural causes. A short video covers the 7 confirmed attempts, and another video discusses Castro's intense love of dairy. In fact, the Central Intelligence Agency allegedly tried to poison his chocolate milkshake as one of the attempts. The mafioso who was supposed to poison the drink broke the capsule when he was taking it out of the freezer. Story 55. In 1985, Philadelphia police bombed a residential neighborhood. The resulting explosion destroyed 2 city blocks, killing 5 children and 6 adults. Story 56. The Tamamshud case. Shortly after World War II, a well-groomed athletic man was found dead on an Australian beach. There was no apparent cause of death, and the man could not be identified. Investigators found mysterious clues, including a book with a cryptic message written in it. Later, they buried his body. It was later suggested that he may have been searching for a child he possibly fathered years earlier, and that the mother may have been a spy who fell in love with a foreign spy, the unidentified man who might have been the child's father. When he realized she would not meet him again, he may have poisoned himself on the beach, possibly using a poison that leaves no trace. Story 57. The life of Harriet Tubman, a household name known for extraordinary courage. Things she did other than the Underground Railroad. 1. She financed and recruited for John Brown's Harper's Ferry slave revolt. The only reason she did not fight in person was that she was bedridden with malaria. 2. During the Civil War, she joined the Union Army as a cook and nurse. 3. She became a spy and scout and helped Union leaders plan raids into Confederate territory. She is reported to have killed several Confederates. 4. She rose in the ranks until she commanded a small raiding force of 300 Union troops from Company C, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, the 2nd Black United States Army Unit. 5. Her command raided southern plantations, killed slave drivers, and freed captive slaves. 6. In the Combahee Ferry raid, in which the 54th freed 700 slaves, she was also in command of 3 Union frigates. When a Confederate division advanced on them, she fired broadsides from the 3 naval warships directly into the enemy troops. 7. She survived the war and immediately began fighting for women's suffrage. Story 58. 9 Italian geologists were charged with manslaughter for failing to predict an earthquake. Good news, I was wrong. They were charged because they did not properly warn people, not because they failed to predict the earthquake. Story 59. I don't know if this counts as a historical event, because it happened in 2010, but the owner of the Segway company, Jimmy Heselden, died when he drove a Segway off a cliff near his estate in Yorkshire. Thank you to everyone who corrected me about the demonstration part. Story 60. In July 1518, residents of the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, were struck by a sudden and seemingly uncontrollable urge to dance. The hysteria began when a woman known as Frau Trophia stepped into the street and began to silently twist, twirl, and shake. She continued her solo dance marathon for nearly a week, and before long some 3 dozen other Strasbourgeois had joined in. By August, the dancing epidemic had claimed as many as 400 victims. The strange episode did not end until September, when the dancers were taken to a mountaintop shrine to pray for absolution. There is no definitive explanation for what happened. Explanations range from a medical condition known as hot blood to curses placed on the population. Story 61. Julie Daubigny was a bisexual swordmaster and opera singer who lived for the thrill. She fought men in sword duels, sometimes topless when anyone doubted she was a woman. She got in trouble for making out with women at royal balls. On one occasion, she became a nun to have sex with another nun and later set fire to the convent. It is remarkable there is not a blockbuster movie about her. Story 62. The whale ship Essex was sunk by a sperm whale. The crew survived in the ship's whaleboats for about 2 months, eventually resorting to cannibalism and drawing lots to decide who would be eaten. The event inspired Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Story 63. Russia's false Dmitri. Ivan the Terrible's son was assassinated at the age of 8. 9 years later, a man claimed to be Dmitri, having survived the assassination attempt. He gained the throne and ruled for 11 months, then was dragged from the palace and publicly executed. The next year, a second impostor declared himself Dmitri. He did not dispute the first impostor's legitimacy but claimed to be the same man who had miraculously survived the apparent execution. He won the support of the first Dmitri's widow and, with her backing, gained the allegiance of the Cossacks, rallying an army of over 10,000 to try to take the throne. Although he failed to retake Moscow, he conquered much of southeastern Russia and ruled until his death 3 years later, when he was killed in a drunken altercation with a Tatar prince. 3 months after that, a third impostor appeared, allegedly emerging from behind a waterfall in Ivangorod and declaring himself Tsar. He followed the second impostor's example, claiming a spiritual reincarnation or miraculous resurrection to present himself as the same man. He won the support of the same Cossacks who had backed the second impostor. A year later, he was forced to flee his stronghold, was speared on the road to Moscow, and secretly executed. He never truly ruled, but historians labeled him False Dmitri III. Sources diverge after this. Some mention a false Dmitri IV, while others count the third impostor twice. The first impostor had been a known fraud. The authorities used him until he became a problem, then executed and quartered him, cremated the remains, placed the ashes in a container, and fired them back to Poland in a cannon. Story 64. He attached weather balloons to a lawn chair and rose to over 15,000 feet. He brought only a pellet gun to shoot balloons, a citizen's band radio, a sandwich, and some beer, and accidentally entered restricted airspace, so he had to contact the Federal Aviation Administration. Story 65. Killdozer. In 2004, a man armored a bulldozer and used it to plow through dozens of buildings in revenge after authorities attempted to close his business. Story 66. 21 Sikh soldiers fought against 10,000 Afghan intruders and won. It is known as the War of Sarigari. Story 67. In the Middle Ages, gay and lesbian people sometimes became nuns and monks to avoid persecution. Because religion was a powerful influence, their devotion to God was seen as noble. They often formed close, intimate relationships, and because pregnancies were unlikely in monastic life, this was not considered a major issue. Story 68. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics sent turtles on a lunar flyby. They returned, making them the first organisms to do so. Mercia one-upped them by sending Neil Armstrong, though. Story 69. In their search for gold in El Dorado, the Spanish conquistadors regularly found large amounts of platinum. Spain had a problem with people counterfeiting gold coins with platinum, so they tossed their entire platinum supply into the ocean. As Red from the organization put it, this debacle is an apt metaphor for the flaws inherent in the colonial system and how the lust for gold literally blinded them to the true value of the New World. If I had read it in a book, I would have called the writer a hack. Story 70. Robert Smalls was born into slavery in Beaufort, South Carolina. He freed himself, his crew, and their families during the American Civil War by commandeering the Confederate transport ship planter in Charleston Harbor on May 13, 1862, and sailing it from Confederate-controlled waters to the United States blockade. He then piloted the ship to the Union-controlled enclave in the Beaufort, Port Royal, and Hilton Head area, where it became a Union warship. His example and persuasion helped convince President Abraham Lincoln to accept African-American soldiers into the Union Army. Story 71. During the Cold War, Americans wanted to intimidate the Russians, so they dropped extra-large condoms labeled small over the Russian army to make them think all Americans had very large genitalia and feel inadequate. Story 72. A man was in Hiroshima when the first atomic bomb was dropped. He survived, then went to Nagasaki a few days later because he did not want to miss a day of work. He was also affected by the second bombing and survived both attacks. This happened to several people. Thanks to a Reddit user for the correction. Story 73. Violet Jessup, known as Miss Unsinkable, was a nurse on the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic and survived all three. She mentioned colorful nicknames such as Go by the Wall and Tickle the Bricks and Iceberg Charlie. She wrote a memoir and died on May 5, 1971. During the sinking of the Britannic, Iceberg Charlie turned on the propeller, thinking they could make it to the mainland, not realizing that lifeboats had already been lowered. The propeller began chopping up the lifeboats and the people inside them like a giant blender. Violet's lifeboat was headed toward the propeller, and everyone else jumped into the water to swim away. Violet could not swim, so she jumped into the water and was pulled around by the force of the propeller until she resurfaced. Story 74. During World War II, Coca-Cola soldiers on the American front lines set up Coca-Cola production facilities to give soldiers a reminder of home and boost morale. Story 75. Dr. Robert Liston performed an operation that reportedly had a 300% mortality rate. While amputating a patient's leg, he accidentally sliced off an assistant's fingers. Both the patient and the assistant died of infection. He also slashed a spectator's coattails. The spectator was so terrified that he died of fright. Story 76. Following the poor sales of E.T., the extraterrestrial for the Atari, the unsold cartridges were dumped in a New Mexico landfill. Story 77. During a war, Zanzibar surrendered to the British after 38 minutes. Story 78. Most of the random, fictional-sounding events in the world are covered on the YouTube channel Salmonella Academy. The videos are hilarious and show how ridiculous some people can be. They are relatively short and keep you interested until the end. Story 79. In 1933, suicide by jumping into an active volcano became so common in Japan that 900 people killed themselves there. And the Tokyo Steamship Company established a special ferry connection to the island with the volcano. Story 80. The Canadian government starved Indigenous people to determine how long it took to die from starvation. Search for Newfoundland flour mix. Story 81. This is not historical, but I doubt you will believe me without a link. About 20 years ago, in my town there was a shooting accident that was shocking. A woman was practicing with her husband's rifle in a field and she fired a shot that traveled to the highway and struck a motorist in the head, killing the driver. The driver was the shooter's twin sister, who had been separated at birth. She lived about 300 miles away and was literally just passing through town when she was killed by a stray bullet from the sister she never knew she had. That is the craziest coincidence I have ever heard. I am going to bed now, so I do not wake to many identical comments. No, I could not find a link. I will say it occurred in Canada, but I am more comfortable being called a liar than giving my exact location. I do not think you would find anything even with that. I did try to search in depth and could not find anything. It is a highly unlikely story with only my word to back it up, so make of it what you will. Good night. Story 82. In the village where my wife grew up, the Japanese lined up all the residents during World War II, who were mostly related to my wife. They shot every third man in the head and raped every fourth woman. This was revenge for my wife's family helping the United States with troop movements behind the occupied Philippines. My wife's grandmother was one of the raped villagers. Her grandfather was one of the executed. My wife's mother was 10 years old and watched the whole thing. Stories like this are not recorded in scholarly books, but they are real historical events nonetheless. Story 83. Sorry, I can't provide content that depicts sexual activity involving animals. I can provide a cleaned, non-explicit version suitable for text-to-speech. There was an experiment funded by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and the United States government in the 1960s to teach a dolphin English so it could potentially be used in place of a human for the space program. A dolphin named Peter was raised from birth in a half-submerged facility with a female trainer. He received daily lessons intended to teach him to pronounce human syllables. Problems emerged when he reached adolescence. Because dolphins may have a strong libido, Peter became aggressive and non-compliant from sexual frustration. Plans to offer visits with female dolphins were canceled, as researchers did not want exposure to typical dolphin behavior to interfere with the experiment. The handler provided physical contact occasionally to reduce his aggressive tendencies, which apparently also improved his lessons. When it became apparent that the dolphin was incapable of learning English and was instead imitating syllable patterns in response to his handler's attention, the researchers took on an additional project to test lysergic acid diethylamide on the dolphin. For reasons that remain unclear, the handler was also given lysergic acid diethylamide. During a visit, the funders discovered these practices and the decision was made to abandon the idea of using dolphins as astronaut substitutes and instead use human astronauts. The experiment ended. Peter was placed in a regular dolphin enclosure, but he had not developed the skills to properly communicate with other dolphins. Depressed, he died by remaining motionless on the bottom of his enclosure until he suffocated. I frequently tell this as my "I am not kidding" weird history story. Story 84. That the government would conduct clandestine experiments on its citizens. The first that comes to mind is the syphilis experiments at Tuskegee. I did not look at countries outside the United States. Wait, there is more. Story 85. When the Vikings came to England, they easily seduced local women. You might ask how. Was it their muscles, their foreign and therefore exotic culture, or their skills? No, it was cleanliness. By combing their hair and bathing once a week, they made themselves more attractive than Englishmen. Story 86. Bootleg margarine, also known as the Margarine Wars. Story 87. In 1738, a British mariner named Robert Jenkins displayed a severed, decomposing ear before the members of Parliament. In formal testimony, he said a Spanish Coast Guard officer had sliced off his ear 7 years earlier as punishment for smuggling. Spurred by this testimony, the British soon declared war on Spain. Thus began the outlandish War of Jenkins' Ear. Story 88. Start of World War I. A doomsday cult's assassination attempt goes wrong until the driver takes a wrong turn, allowing events to unfold differently. An armed conflict between two countries escalates because each had allies, and those allies had their own allies. Soon Europe is engulfed in war, with nations from around the world participating in what was then called the Great War or the War to End All Wars. In reality, it was only a prelude to the far greater destruction and human brutality of World War II. Story 89. There was a 350-year war between the Netherlands and a small island near England. There were no casualties on either side. The Netherlands sent its fleet to the island and declared war, but the islanders refused to engage. The fleet returned and eventually forgot they were still at war. 350 years later, a man found a document during a cleanup stating the war had never been officially ended. The war was then formally declared over. Story 90. The Killdozer. Marvin Heemeyer was a welder in Granby, Colorado, who became angry with the local government. They denied his request to build a road to his muffler repair shop to bypass a new factory that was built over the existing road. They later fined him for not being connected to the sewage line after a worker building the factory had cut the connection. Heemeyer then bought and modified a bulldozer, installing armor plating about 1 foot thick, roughly 30 centimeters, and 3 gun ports for a 50 caliber rifle, 308 semi-automatic rifle, and a 22 caliber long rifle. He also installed several video cameras to allow him to see outside. He drove the armored bulldozer on a rampage, damaging or demolishing 13 buildings and causing over $7 million in damage. Only Heemeyer died. He killed himself after his vehicle became stuck. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.